Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about shame and the shadow. Alright, so this is the second video in the Shame and Love series, and basically in this series I'm sharing all of my recent insights about shame and about love. So in this video we're going to be talking about shame as it relates to the shadow. So as a quick definition, basically what the shadow is it's basically like the dark closet of the psyche where we put all of the aspects that we are either unable or unwilling to have integrated with us at the time. So we put aspects in the shadow either to maintain our worldview, maintain our ego, or to cope with trauma or to cope with unmet needs. And basically when we push these aspects into the shadow, we become unconscious to them. And these aspects sort of like become their own autonomous mini personalities that have to essentially manipulate us as the conscious personality into getting their needs met. So that's the shadow in a nutshell. And shame is one of the main reasons why we push elements of ourself into the shadow, why we fragment ourselves, why we split ourselves off. Basically, if we have a certain idea that a part of us is inherently bad, inherently unworthy, inherently unlovable, which is essentially what shame is, then we are going to fragment that aspect of our psyche off and we're going to put it in the dark closet of the shadow. So basically, what shame is a deep sense that either we or a part of ourselves is inherently unlovable, invalid, unworthy, inferior, unimportant, etc. So it's essentially denoting an inherent lack of value and the sense that that thing should not be. And so whenever we have a sense of that thing in my personality should not be, what we'll have a tendency to do is we'll have a tendency to push it into the shadow and become unconscious of it. And oftentimes, if we have just learned that something is inherently shameful from the get-go, we may not even allow ourselves to be conscious of it in the first place. So an example I gave in my last shame-related video is, let's say I grew up in a society where they thought creativity was evil. Well, ultimately, if I think that creativity is inherently evil and shameful and wrong and bad and negative, well, what's going to happen is if I have any kind of creative impulse like creeping up is, number one, I'm going to feel extreme amounts of shame, and I'm going to go into an immediate denial about having that quality within myself. I'm going to push it into the shadow. I'm going to fragment off my creative aspects, and I'm going to stick them so deep in the unconscious that hopefully I can never find them. And I'm going to instead cling to an identity of goodness, which in this case would be one that has no creativity to it and maybe even stands up as a guard against evil creatives, right? So basically, what we end up doing is we end up polarizing and splitting, and then we hyper-identify with whatever we think will redeem us and make us good and make us lovable and make us valid, to the exclusion of whatever we think will make us bad, wrong, shameful, invalid, inferior, etc. And what happens along with this kind of process of sticking what we find shameful about ourselves in the shadow and then becoming unconscious to that being there is that what will happen is we're going to project that out onto reality. So if there's a person who maybe kind of holds some of those qualities that we pushed away in ourselves, we might have a tendency to project that out onto that person, then we start shaming that person or judging that person, or maybe we'll just feel really uncomfortable around them and get an icky feeling. So for example, if I'm the person who grew up in the society that said, oh, if you're creative, you're evil, or if you're creative, you're bad, then anybody who has like something about them that's creative or that maybe even is very proud of being creative, I'm going to think that they're inherently shameful, bad, wrong, evil, etc. Because if I'm already pushing it away in myself, and if I'm already sort of shaming that element of myself, even if I'm unconscious to it, I'm going to be doing the same kind of shaming to that person externally to me. And so what happens is that basically when we polarize like this, where we say this is a good thing and this is the bad, wrong, shameful thing, what we do is we can create a lot of internal splits within ourselves, and then we can start pointing the finger at other people and shaming them as well, and just orienting to them in this very judgmental, invalidating way. So basically, when it comes to, let's say, shame and these aspects being put in the shadow, they're ultimately being done for the sake of ego preservation, to keep us away from deeper feelings of shame. So when it comes to ego preservation, what we're ultimately trying to do is trying to preserve the self-concept of goodness. So it's the sense of like whatever is going to make us good, whatever is going to make us redeemable, whatever is going to make us worthy, we will cling on very tightly to those identities to the exclusion of anything that we think will make us shameful and bad and unworthy and inferior. And so another example that I would give is, let's say that I decide that in order to be good, a person has to be very pacifistic, and then anybody who shows any signs of anger is showing something shameful, something that's bad, something that's maybe a little evil, something that's wrong, right? So if I project this dichotomy of good and bad, or good and evil, or valid and invalid onto pacifism and, let's say, anger and assertiveness and other things over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a polarization within myself, and I'm going to hyper-identify with being a pacifist. And then if I have any element within myself that contradicts this identity of being a pacifist, like if I have any kind of sign that I get a little bit angry or irritated, even if it's just mildly, if I've, let's say, held on so tightly to pacifism as my way to prove myself good and therefore not shameful, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push away and I'm going to become unconscious to anything. So I'm not going to be able to admit to myself that I feel angry, and I'm genuinely going to convince myself that, oh, I never get angry. You know, only weak people get angry, only shameful people get angry, right? So basically, when we have this clear sense of shame, in the sense that this thing, this quality, this type of person is inherently invalid and wrong and not good, what we're going to do is we're basically going to be cutting away elements of our psyche left and right. And the more we have a tendency to cast shame onto other people and cast shame onto certain qualities, and to say these are the invalid elements of reality, or these things are inherently not lovable, what we do is we become more and more fragmented in ourselves, and we get a much more dense and fragmented shadow. But really, whenever we're trying to preserve our ego, we're trying to preserve one and only ego concept, and that is the concept of goodness. We're trying to cling so tightly to goodness so that we don't fall and get cast into the light of our own shame. So if we have a tendency to shame certain elements in other people, what we'll do is we'll have a tendency to say, oh, let me cling to these types of things. That way I don't deem my own self shameful. So the more we shame others and the more we shame elements of ourselves, the deeper we're going to have to fragment ourselves to be acceptable in our own eyes. And we can project this idea of goodness and shamefulness onto lots of different things. We can project the dichotomy of good and evil, or good and bad, or worthy and unworthy onto any pairs of qualities. And we can even decide that, like, different from other people about what's good and what's bad. So for example, let's say that there is a politician, right, in the 1960s, right? And this politician, let's say, identifies with being like serious and pragmatic, right? And, you know, just being, you know, very streamlined, and because he thinks that that's like the good thing. And then anything that's frivolous and like kind of like, you know, kind of playful and this kind of thing, well, he just sees that as fundamentally weak and bad, and, you know, maybe it's a little suspect, maybe it's a little immoral, right? So this is the way that this politician in the 1960s is seeing that. And so he's maybe having a tendency to judge the hippies, right? And he's like, oh, those hippies, you know, they're bad, they're evil, they're you know, stupid, whatever condemning, shameful term that he's using. Whereas he casts himself as the good guy. He's like, I'm the serious pragmatist that can make things work well. And these kids are weak. You know, they don't know what they're talking about. Their perspective is invalid. Everything about them is invalid. They're shameful, right? And so basically what he's going to be doing is he's basically going to be pushing away anything in himself that is hippie-like. So if he has any urges to have fun or to be lighthearted, what's ultimately going to happen is he's going to vehemently push those away from himself, to the point where he probably wouldn't even be able to be aware that he has those qualities in and of themselves. because he cast such a harsh kind of shame onto hippies that he's not going to fundamentally be able to see anything within himself that happens to cast him in the light of shame. Anything that's similar is going to be demonized. And basically any kind of judgment outward is going to beget a judgment inward, and any judgment inward is going to beget a judgment outward. Now let's say on the flip side, let's say that there's a hippie in the 1960s, right? And he looks at, let's say, people like that politician, and he's like, oh, these people, they're so serious and they're so out of touch and they do all these terrible things. You know what? They're bad. They're wicked, they're evil, they're shameful. Whereas we hippies, we're fun-loving, we're peace-loving, and we're going to be really connected, and we want to be connected to each other and to the planet. And these politicians, they're just bad and evil and wicked and wrong, and all of these serious people are just, you know, causing so many problems, right? And so what's going to happen is that being a hippie becomes that hippie's identity of goodness. And then the identity of shamefulness, the things that are cast into shadow, would be things like seriousness, right? And so basically what's going to happen is that that person, if they have any drives to be more grounded or more serious, they're going to relate it back to that politician and to the other people that they're judging and shaming, and they're not going to be able to integrate that within themselves. And essentially what they're going to do is they're going to end up in this polarized state. And then of course, whenever they meet someone like the politician in the initial example, well, they're going to feel a lot of judgment and they're going to shame. And so what ends up happening is that if that politician and if one of these hippies meet, what's going to happen is they're going to be essentially a representation of one another's shadow. And they're going to be projecting their own shadows onto that other person, and they're going to be orienting to that other person in the same way they would orient to the things that were repressed. So in the politician's case, he's going to be repressing his inner hippie and then projecting it and shaming it out onto this other hippie out here. Same thing with the hippie. He's going to be rejecting his inner seriousness. And then when he sees someone who's serious like this politician, he's going to be projecting all of the ways that he judges and shames away his own inner serious aspect. So whenever we polarize like this, no matter how much of an unquestioned good we see the things are that we are identifying with, understanding that what we're fundamentally doing is we're creating a schism within ourselves. We're creating a split. We're creating shadows when we do this. And then what can happen is we can end up in this polarization where we feel like we're in this big battle of good against evil, where we're the good guy and we're the righteous ones, and then those people over there are the bad ones. And we can essentially project our shadow and scapegoat any individual and any group of people. And what we do is we create a lot of turmoil when we do this. And so when we do this, when we identify with one thing that we've said is good, we determine that this over here is the opposite of that, and that's antithetical to that identity of goodness. And we shame that aspect away from ourselves. So we create what I call an oppositional split. So an oppositional split is where we say, this is the good and righteous thing, and therefore I'm going to identify with it and hyper-identify with it, hold on to it really tightly. And then here's the other part that I see as invalid, bad, and wrong, and I'm going to shame this aspect away from myself, saying this part is invalid, I don't want to see this in myself. And so in that oppositional split, what happens is that we polarize the personality out of our natural authenticity. We don't allow ourselves to be as we are, because if we allowed ourselves to be as we are, we would be cast under the light of our own shame when we start to notice that we share the qualities of other people that we shame, or that we have the qualities that we've decided are invalid and something that makes a person bad and evil and wrong and inferior and unlovable. But when we do this, no matter how much of an unquestioned good or an unquestioned bad you see these things as, you end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You end up pushing away things in yourself that are really vital to you, that are really important to integrate. You know, so an example in my own life is that when I was about 12 years old, I decided that I was going to be really, really laid back, and I was going to avoid being mean in any way, shape, or form, which, you know, it's like on the surface level, doesn't that sound so good? I'm going to identify with being this really cool, chilled out, laid back person, and I'm going to just totally get rid of meanness. Can't we all decide that meanness is such a bad and terrible and awful quality? Well, it depends on how you are defining meanness here, right? So what I ended up with was a situation where I could only ever express things that were like laid back. And if I should ever want to express a boundary of mine and say, hey, I'm not okay with this and I don't feel comfortable with this, well, ultimately I'm trying so hard to avoid meanness that I actually got rid of my assertive qualities. And I would end up in a lot of situations that were very painful because I just couldn't draw upon that, because I had labeled like meanness as evil and sort of defined so many things that were very vital qualities to me as mean. So my assertiveness was mean, you know, to stand up for myself was mean, to draw lines in the sand was mean. And so I pushed all those things away. And ultimately I ended up with this like mean girl in my shadow, who in reality is just the part of me that wants to stand up for myself and assert my own boundaries. So whenever we have a dichotomy that seems to be an unquestioned good and an unquestioned bad, we want to question that. We want to actually see what's underneath that and see if the things that we're labeling as bad and irredeemable are actually more complex than that, where there's more reasons for us to really need those qualities that we've maybe written off, that we've labeled as bad, labeled as, let's say, inherently non-valuable. So the question being here, how do we actually end up getting past the oppositional splits and bringing them back together? How can we hold space for qualities that we have judged away as shameful and judged away as wrong? How do we reintegrate these shadow aspects that we've cast into the dark closet of the psyche because we've labeled them shameful? Well, one of the first things we want to recognize is the times that we've actually created these splits within ourselves. So the first step that I would recommend is write out a list of certain qualities and their opposites. And essentially look at those qualities and see if there's any that you hyper-identify with and see as an unquestioned good, or any that you would label as an unquestioned evil, right? Looking at anything on the list where you've said, oh, let's say something like attention seeking or something like that. Oh, attention seeking is bad, and if you can be more humble, maybe that's on the other side of it. So it's like, yeah, humility is an unquestioned good, and then attention seeking, that's just like, that's weak, that's bad, that's wrong, that's evil, that's shameful, right? And so if you've dichotomized this way, maybe you have an inner attention seeking, maybe some inner child aspect that actually really needs to be able to receive that. So if we've dichotomized this way, we want to look for any dichotomy of opposites where we have labeled one thing as an unquestioned good, the other thing is an unquestioned bad, and we want to see what we really have this visceral grasping and aversion response to. You know, so any quality that we hyper-identify with and really cling on to is very important to our identity. And anything that we have like this, ugh, I would hate to be associated with that. When we feel this visceral sense of aversion, that can give us a strong clue as to what we might be repressing. And then once you've made this list, I want you to pick out those qualities that you have that aversive reaction to, the one that goes, ugh, I don't like this, right? And I want you to think about somebody who embodies that quality, somebody who probably gets on your nerves. So whenever we have like judgments, this is why judgments are such a useful thing when it comes to shadow work. Oftentimes we'll judge in other people what we actually have in our own shadow. So if you notice yourself feeling very aversive to certain qualities or certain people, this can be very helpful. So if you notice a quality that you have a visceral aversion to, just notice somebody in your life that has that quality. So let's say if I decided that, let's say, anger was bad and wrong and shameful, well, I might think about somebody who's always getting angry, right? And instead of writing it off and labeling it out as like something that's just bad and wrong and they shouldn't do that and they should be a different way, well, I want to think about, okay, if this person is chronically angry all the time, maybe they are causing problems, but is there a reason why they're always angry? Is there something that's really bothering them? And usually with anger, there's a sense of powerlessness, especially chronic anger. And so maybe this is the only way they feel like they can defend themselves. So what I might notice is that there's actually quite noble intentions for themselves and quite benevolent intentions underneath this quality that I've judged as shameful and bad and wrong. And then I can start to think, well, if the exalted form of anger here is sort of self-protection and self-respect, what is it within myself that I might need to incorporate? Maybe this anger response that I've labeled as shameful actually has some gems to it after all. And I can begin to find ways to incorporate things like dignity and boundaries and self-respect and basically being able to stand up for myself, being able to stand up for others. And I can start to see this quality that I've labeled maybe before as just meanness, as just shameful, right? And I can start to see the gems within that quality. And that's going to enable me to stop judging away that quality and start to really find the gems, find the positive things. And then I can more easily incorporate that into my self-concept and actually integrate relative to that now positive quality, whereas before I was just writing it off as shameful. All right, so here's a list of potential qualities that you can kind of look at and see if you have that grasping and aversion reaction to. And then again, choose the ones that you're aversive to, and then find that person and then figure out what is the reason why they might consistently be acting that way. And once you can actually practice compassion and understand the validity of that person's perspective and why they are the way they are, you can then start to validate these aspects that have been pushed into the shadow. And you can start to invite them back into your conscious personality to integrate with the rest of the whole. All right. Anyway, so that's all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment. Also, if you would like to learn more about shadow work, go ahead and check out my free shadow integration masterclass. It's an hour long, and I give you my 6 steps to shadow integration. And so it's very practical and it's totally free. And basically all you have to do is put in your email and you'll be able to watch it instantly. But anyway, that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.